Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm the Reverend Christine Dance, and I am honored to serve as the minister at UUCP. Welcome to UUCP's online worship service. This morning, the topic is perfectionism and why we don't need it, and we just proved it by your minister running sound and not able to run the opening slide at the same time. So we're starting us off on just the right note on that. In this time when we are physically distant, we believe it is an act of love and radical inclusion to worship online and be together in this way. Welcome to our worship. Welcome home. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, a very special welcome to you. We have a special Get to Know UUCP gathering right after the service where you can learn more about us. The Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Phoenix strives to be a spiritual community for our time, for this time, focused on diverse theological perspectives, radical inclusion, and knowing that issues of justice and equity shape everything we do. With a special awareness for those who have been historically marginalized, we welcome all. Of every race, class, ethnicity, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious background, mental and physical ability and disability. We welcome your whole self, your family, however you define it, into our worship as we build a community of caring and courage and hope. Our opening words this morning are from Rebecca Del Rio. Come new to this day. Remove the rigid overcoat of experience, the notion of knowing, the beliefs that cloud your vision. Leave behind the stories of your life. Spit out the sour taste of unmet expectation. Let the stale scent of what ifs waft back into the swamp of your useless fears. Arrive curious without the armor of certainty, the plans and planned results of the life you've imagined. Live the life that chooses you, new every breath, every blink of your astonished eyes. I invite you to grab a chalice or a candle from your home as we recite our covenant, and my wife Karen lights our chalice here in the sanctuary. Love is the doctrine of this congregation. The quest for truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to share our strength in fellowship. Thus do we covenant.
Good morning, everyone. Let me introduce our worship team. I am Carrie Lifshitz, and I am your worship associate today. Our music today is being led by Mary Coda. Our Together time will be led by our Assistant Director of Children's Ministries, Rose Coué Pasco. Our Zoom operator today is Glenn Lockwood, and our chat chaplain today is Kathleen Waldron. And our communications and technology coordinator is Becca Briley. Our chat is open. You can chat with everyone or just to our panelists. Our service is automatically captioned for maximum accessibility. As always, we invite you to check in to UUCP on social media with the hashtag UUAnywhere. And for those of us who are a little older, it's the # UUAnywhere. So there's so much to do in our community, which you can find in our newsletter, Compass. You can sign up for Compass at our website, phoenixuu.org. I'm sad and honored to tell you that Mary Coda will be leaving UUCP. Mary Coda has been our congregation's pianist and our choir's accompanist since 2014. After playing for congregations since she was 14 years old, she has decided to step down soon so that she can attend church with her family on Sundays and nurture her Episcopal roots. Her last service as our pianist will be on Sunday, October 17th, and we will take some time during that service to appreciate her. We are happy to support Mary as she gives her children a foundation in faith and grateful to have so many years to get to know her and hear her play. Please write a message in our online card for Mary. You can do this anytime through Sunday, October 17th I'm not even going to try that. It's going to be in the chat. The link will be in the chat. So from Mary says this: thank you to each and every member of UUCP for your love and inclusion. It has been my pleasure to make music with you and these past 7 years. It has been a blessing to be part of such a loving and respectful environment. Thank you for all of this and more. I will miss you very much. And Mary, we will definitely miss you. You are part of our family and our community. This past Tuesday, your Board of Trustees passed a plan for gradually reopening our campus. Look for more information about this plan this week, as well as opportunities to discuss it. This year is going to be one of flexibility and adjustment. Thank you in advance for the understanding, flexibility, and care you have for our congregation. Finally, our offering is being collected virtually, just like our service. We ask you to be generous in your giving to support the mission of our beloved community. You can text UUCP to 73256. You can donate through the website, or you can send a check. And if you haven't sent in your pledge for the next fiscal year, please do so as soon as you can. You can find the link in the chat. For all that you give to our congregation, we are so grateful.
Good morning, UUCP. Our opening hymn will be Come, Come, Whoever You Are. I invite you to sing with me. Come, come, whoever you are, wonder, worshiper, lover of living. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. Come, come, whoever you are, wonder, worshiper, lover of living. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rose Kuwait Pasco, and you can call me Mix Rose. Today, I'd like to tell you a story about when I learned that I had a culture, that my family had a culture. Let me tell you about dinner time in my house, in my grandparents' house when I was young. When it was time for dinner, time for the one meal of the day where we all ate together at the table, there was a lot to experience. So before it was time to eat, the kitchen would be full of movement and teamwork. My relatives would be calling back and forth about what was ready and what wasn't ready, where to find more napkins or drinks, who should come through and grab this, which plastic tubs in the fridge weren't actually full of butter, but had mashed potatoes or pasta salads that needed to come out to the table. And if you weren't in a helping mood or you needed some quiet before dinner, that was always okay. But if that was the day you were having, it was a good idea to find a place out of sight of the kitchen so that everyone else knew but you needed some space that day. So when things were all ready for us to eat, we would pick up our own plates and we would take them to where the food was and fill our plates up with exactly what we wanted on our plate. And then we would sit at the table. When we sat at the table, it was time to eat and it was time to talk. In my family, the right way to talk, to have a conversation at the dinner table with lots of family members, is to talk over and around and under and through the other conversations that are happening at the same time. And usually also while a TV is playing somewhere out of sight, but not out of hearing range. So there was always lots to hear and lots of conversations to join and switch between and questions to answer. And in these conversations in my family, the right way to react when someone's words would get mixed up while they're talking is to point it out. Like when you mean to say potatoes and carrots, but your mouth says potatoes and parrots, it's really funny. And the person whose mouth made the funny moment maybe didn't hear the funny thing they said, and they should get to enjoy how funny it was with you. Now, I said this story was about culture. Why am I talking about dinner time and potatoes and parrots? Well, when I was young, my family's dinner time was the only way to do it that I knew about. It wasn't until I got a little older and went to share meals at other people's houses that I learned there were other ways for families to be together, other habits that weren't like my family's habits. In a friend's family, when I went to visit them, the right way to prepare for their dinner was to wash your hands, help set the table if you were asked, and definitely to stay out of the kitchen so the person who was cooking could concentrate and work and have lots of space so they wouldn't trip over people coming through to ask to be helpful. It wasn't helpful in their kitchen. And when it was time to eat, the right way to fill your plate was to sit down where your plate was and wait for the dishes to be passed to you. And I thought, wow, this is a completely new way to do dinner time. But the biggest surprise for me was to realize the right way to have a conversation at this table wasn't to layer them all together, woven together or stacked like flapjacks, but to have conversations where everyone talked one after the other, like train cars or beads in a necklace. And it was brand new to me that conversations can take other shapes. So it was a really big realization and maybe a little stressful in the moment when I was learning all of these new ways to be, that there could be different habits, different expectations when I was in different places. And a way to think about different habits and expectations and places is to call it a culture. So that was how I learned that my family had a culture and that maybe other families had their own cultures. Now, culture can be a small word and it can be a big word. It's not just family sized. Your work or your school and your classroom might have its own culture, its own habits. Your city can have a culture. The state that your city is in can have a big culture where we share some things in common. And countries are a very big culture bubble. There's lots of different sizes that we're inside of at the same time, like boop, 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 whoa. But like a bubble, if you're inside it, seeing that culture can be tricky and wibbly wobbly. Like how when all my experiences took place inside my own family bubble, that was my entire picture. Clearly, the right way to do the things is this way, the way my family does it. But right way, wrong way, that's not really how it's the best way to think about it. Our differences in our cultures, they're not as simple as right and wrong. There's no perfect necessarily. There can be like a benefit to adjusting our habits, trying out new experiences, seeing if someone else's way of doing the thing is more interesting and maybe feels really good to do to you, and you just never tried it that way before. But the difference between my friend's house and my house, it wasn't inherently about one of us needed to judge the other. It was about learning to understand myself in relation to each other, and expand the awareness in a way that improves our ability to be in relationship and community with each other. And I do think the bigger that bubble of culture around us is, the harder it is to see. Like, I didn't see my small bubble until I went outside of it. And you can think of the state we're in as maybe like a medium large bubble. And I have traveled outside of it, the state bubble. And when I did, I learned that other states have different driving cultures, different road habits and expectations. I visited my friend in Colorado, and they had a special road that you would pay for a pass to drive on it. And if you didn't have the pass, that lane on the freeway, you weren't supposed to use it unless you had that pass already. So that was something I had to learn, and I didn't see until I left the bubble of my state. But so how do you see a culture that you're inside of when you've never traveled outside of it? Or it's a bubble that's so big that maybe outside the bubble is really, really far away, or maybe not even a thing you can physically go outside of. That's tricky, right? Tricky to think about. Oh, how do I get outside of a big cultural bubble to see it? Well, sometimes the answer is reading about it or hearing a friend talk about it. Or someone you trust is excited to share a new idea with you. Because these bubbles of culture, they can be as invisible as the air inside of the bubble is, right? As invisible as water might be to a fish that's swimming. If we think of it instead of bubbles, we think of it as fish tanks. A fish doesn't necessarily know they're swimming inside of water. They can't see it. It is. It's where you are. This is how life looks here. So what we're talking about today, white supremacy culture, it might be really new to learn about. Thinking of it as a thing that exists, a thing that's been around us this whole time. But lucky for us, we aren't a fish. We're not swimming in literal water that we have to stay inside of. We don't have to keep swimming. We can leave the water. We can learn new ways to be together. So I'd like to end with Miss Katie's wonderful way to end Together Times. Everyone, please remember that you are very powerful and you are very loved.
Rose, I think this was a fabulous observation of the dinner table that I've never thought about before. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to share a little part of a piece that you all probably have heard, for Elise by Beethoven, to talk a little bit about pianists and perfectionism. So that that was like the express version of for Elise. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how pianists practice tricky spots like that spot that is a little bit gnarly, to say the least. So if I was going to sit down in my practice room, the first thing I might do is to play something called Rhythm 1, R1. Then after I do R1, I might do R2, Rhythm 2. Then after that, after I've done all the rhythms that I can think of, which could be endless, I might do something called repeated notes. It's a little bit tricky. I could do this all day, literally. I could do this the entire service and you would not want to hear that at all. So I'll just stop right there and tie that into perfectionism. So when I was learning piano, I spent a lot of time practicing this way to try to make music perfectly clean or perfectly even. And I felt a lot of pressure in a performance to have the music be that way. It did not come naturally to me at all. So as a child, I spent a very long time, many hours, sometimes hours every day, practicing like this, doing rhythms, doing repeated notes, all things that you think could probably drive you crazy doing. So the first thing about perfectionism is that it can lead us to miss out on a lot of wonderful life experiences and a lot of relationships. The second thing is that perfectionism can lead to a lot of anxiety and especially performance anxiety. So as a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, I was performing a lot, and I sometimes felt that if I hadn't done all the practice techniques on a certain spot, that that was not right. And so in a performance, I would think to myself, did I do all of the rhythms and all of these different things to the spot? If I hadn't, I would get nervous and sometimes just mess up the spot just for no reason. So that was a bit of a struggle, and sometimes I still have that issue. And especially when I first started playing for UUCP, it was in pretty high gear. So perfectionism can definitely lead to a lot of anxiety. And the third big thing that I think is that perfectionism can lead us to not do a lot of things for fear of not doing them perfect. For example, in piano, some pianists and some piano teachers encourage their students to play only pieces that they're going to play perfectly or very well, especially if they're in a competition or a big performance. So that can cause us to miss out on a lot of beautiful works of music, just because we might miss a note here or there. That applies to me, for example. Maybe I won't sing as much because I'm used to working with people who like opera singers who've been training their whole life, and I think I can't do it like that. But I just try to go for it, even though I haven't trained for 20 years. So what is the antidote to all of this? For me, when I find myself getting on the obsessive part of the spectrum, the achievement spectrum, I try to focus on my relationship with myself and fostering and enjoying my relationship with other people. That's been the best antidote to this kind of thinking for me, and especially having kids, because your mind can't be in the piano all the time. So I think definitely focusing on relationships with people is one of the big secrets. I know this is very specific to piano, But I hope that it helps you reflect on perfectionism in your own life and professions, and how to find the antidote for whenever you fall on the too far on the achievement spectrum in the obsessive part. Hope this helped you think a little bit more about it. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm just over here so enjoying having Mix Rose talk about this and hearing Mary talk about this. Like, my heart is just so full. Thank you, both of you, for that. So this is the time when we share the joys and sorrows of our community, and being together, it is good to share and to support each other. So I invite you to write any joys or sorrows that you want our community to know about in the chat. Please put your name at the beginning so I know who it is. And if you want it not to be shared out loud, put the word private at the beginning. And while you are entering your joys and sorrows, let me share a few. So I wanted to let you know, and we had not shared this before because she had requested it, but our beloved sexton, Belinda Clark, had surgery last Thursday. Belinda was diagnosed with stage 1 lung cancer. And they had a surgery to go out and take out the piece of cancer in her lung. There was a lot of different ways the surgery could have gone. It went the very best way possible. So she is recovering at home and told me that I could tell you all. Now, for those of you who don't know, Belinda has been with us for many, many years. This is also Belinda's 4th time having cancer. She is incredibly resilient and very strong, and as committed to take care of this. And a little bonus, she stopped smoking. So we are very, very proud of Belinda, and we love you very much. I also want to hold the sorrow in our country that we have hit another marker of 700,000 people who have died from COVID-19. And every time we hit these markers and every time we hear about someone else we know, I want to acknowledge the grief that we are collectively holding in that. And I also want to acknowledge that so many of you thought we were going to be done with this pandemic by now. And last year you were holding on until we could get to the point after the vaccinations and it would be over. And you're still holding on. And I want to acknowledge that some of you can't hold on anymore, and it's just too hard. Others of you are barely holding on. Some of you are doing quite well and consider yourselves fortunate. And for all of you who have lost anyone to this terrible pandemic, I want you to know I'm holding you in my heart, and we are holding each other as we go through this together. Let us turn to the joys and sorrows in our community. Oh, I'm seeing so much love in the chat for everyone. We have a joy from Sherry Stafford that my 8-year-old granddaughter Addison has fully recovered from having COVID. So grateful. Oh, I can't imagine, Sherry, how hard that was for you. I'm so glad. Jira says, we did family yoga at our home today. How wonderful. We have Michelle and Sam say that sorry that Mary is leaving and so grateful that she has been such an integral part of our lives, our music, and our love. Bunny says, a joy, so excited to attend yesterday's Women's March, my first protest march ever. Sorry for the fact we need to march for reproductive rights, but proud that we have the right to organize and show up for this issue. For all of you who showed up from UUCP, it was a wonderful time. I hope we have more people like Bunny who said, yeah, let me try this protest thing. as you feel safe, and certainly there's plenty of things to march about. And from Larry Reed and Linda Vance, they say they are enjoying granddaughter Casey, who spent the night with us. She enriches our lives with music, art, and being a very loving 12-year-old. How wonderful. Ed Cernick says, Bonnie and I got our boosters last Wednesday. Hooray for the rounds of folks that are getting their booster vaccines. So thrilled to hear that. Susan Morris says, Duke and I have the luxury of a whole month away from Phoenix for the first time in lovely Flagstaff. Love you all. Oh, good. Hope you get to see some leaves turning. And Kathleen W says, went to a family birthday yesterday and got to see our 3-year-old great nephew for the first time since Christmas 2019. And Bela Perez says, a joy that he may get his vaccine soon. Oh, I do hope so, Bela. I do hope so. Christine Carmona has a joy. She has taken Vicky's advice and bought an electric kettle. She's enjoyed washing her face every morning with warm water scents. Oh, the small pleasures. And a joy from John Reed. My sister gave me a potted tree for my new house. I believe that is it at this point. So I invite you now into a time of meditation and prayer. I invite you to center your body, to let go of whatever else you might be doing. Even if you're watching worship while doing something else, maybe set down the dish rag for a second. Take a few deep breaths. And I want to lead you in an imagination meditation. I want you to imagine that every time you looked in the mirror, you saw only the beauty of your soul, your kindness, and the wonderful body that is guiding you through this life. I want you to imagine what it would be like if that every time you met a new person, that they could see your heart and your kindness, and there wouldn't be no self-doubt or worry if you were good enough. I want you to imagine that in any kind of situation where you feel like you have to perform, whether that is school or work or an interview, that you feel like what you are doing is good enough, and that you knew intrinsically inside that you were worthy and that you did not need anyone from the outside telling you what your performance was, what your grade was, and that you knew you were good enough. I want you to imagine that whatever messages of perfectionism that you were told as a child, a young adult, now, wherever you are, that you could shake those off and let you be just fully you, whole as a human being. Imagine if every child had visions of love and kindness every time they spoke, that they would feel love and acceptance and beauty. Imagine as you listen to this song about having no mirrors in your Nana's house and seeing only love and kindness reflected back to you.
There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. And the beauty that I saw in everything, the beauty in everything, yeah, was in her eyes. Oh, was in her eyes. I'm telling you, there were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. I never knew that my skin was too black, and I never knew that my nose was too flat, and I never knew that my clothes didn't fit, and I never knew there were things that I missed, 'cause the beauty in everything, oh, was in her eyes, was in her eyes. Oh, there were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. The world outside was a magical place. I only knew love and I didn't know hate. And the beauty that I saw in everything, the beauty in everything, yeah, was in her eyes. Was in her eyes. Child, look deep into my 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 eyes.
Yeah.
There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. And the beauty that I saw in everything, the beauty in everything, yeah, was in her eyes. Oh, was in her eyes. I'm telling you, there were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. I never knew that my skin was too black, and I never knew that my nose was too flat, and I never knew that.
Oh, I love that song. It's beautiful. So I don't know how many of you know this, but I enjoy crafting, scrapbooks, cross stitch, t-shirts, signs. I like it all. Well, except sewing. But what it has taken me years to discover is that none of my creations needs to be perfect. I remember getting out a ruler to make sure pictures were straight on a scrapbook page, or making sure a science poster was just right while looking over and seeing someone else do it, just plopping things on, and I was there measuring. This would also happen with cross-stitching. Sometimes I'd have one misplaced stitch, and I'd take out rows and rows for just this one stitch that only I would notice. Nobody else would notice. When I had kids, I really had to tamp down the idea of getting things perfect. I would watch my kids work on school projects, and I sometimes had to sit on my hands so I wouldn't make something straighter or more colorful or neater. I realized that I loved my kids' creations more because each creation was an expression of their own self. And I may be biased, but they're each pretty amazing. It took me longer to translate that to my own work. Each creation I make is my own creation. And if there's an imperfection, it only makes it that much more personal. I try to apply that to all aspects of my life. Is my house one of those perfect show houses? No way, not at all. My house is a come in and put your feet up kind of house. And I love that. And I've learned to embrace the imperfection because that's what makes us real. We're not all made from the same mold. We're all different, and those differences should be welcomed and celebrated. And if someone doesn't like my messy house or my creation, then that's not perfect, then maybe that's their loss.
It is their loss, Carrie. The sermon today is broken into two parts because I want to explain the series, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about perfectionism. On June 13th of this year, this past June, this congregation voted on affirming and including an additional principle to the 7 that the Unitarian Universalist Association affirms. We are one of 117 congregations and 20 UU organizations that have now passed the 8th principle, an act that we hope will influence our denomination to take similar action. The 8th principle states, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant and affirm to promote, and this is where the 8th principle starts, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Now, some people didn't like how wordy it was. Some didn't like that it wasn't parallel to the other principles. But most people who discussed this principle in our congregation agreed it is not a passive statement. It calls us to action. So here we are in this program year, this most interesting year, and we are being called to act on this 8th principle. And how are we going to do that? Well, here's one way that I'm going to do it, is I am going to be having a sermon series throughout this year on the characteristics of white supremacy culture and the antidotes for them. These characteristics have become well known in activist circles, and I personally have found them very useful in understanding how the culture I live in, like Rose so well explained, how that culture works against living into the ideal, my ideal, of an anti-racist multicultural society. I hope that they are going to be helpful to you as well. The characteristics of white supremacy culture were first published by Tima Okun with help from his mentor and collaborator, the late Kenneth Jones, in 1999. Okun has continued to refine them and incorporate learnings about them through the several anti-racism publications and workshops that he has. And they have been discussed and reviewed in a lot of different ways through activist works. Okun says, culture is powerful precisely because it is so present and at the same time so difficult to name or identify. The characteristics listed below are damaging because they are used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen by the group. They're damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. Because we all live in a white supremacy culture, these characteristics show up in the attitudes and behaviors of all of us, people of color and white people. Therefore, these attitudes and behaviors can show up in any group or organization, whether it is white-led or predominantly white, or people are color-led or predominantly people of color. Okun is very clear that these characteristics are not the way to understand white supremacy culture. Instead, they are one way. And there is a lot to unpack to even understand the term white supremacy culture, which some of you may bristle at. But for these purposes, we're going to be discussing it similar to how Rose described it, as the water we swim in, the water that is defined mostly by white cultures and norms, that looking at the culture that we are in and saying, is that everyone's culture? Is that the culture we want? And in order to break down the racism that exists in our culture, we need to break down the culture itself. So this year, we are going to consider perfectionism, urgency, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, fear of open conflict, and individualism. The others, defensiveness, the idea that there is one right way, paternalism, either or binary thinking, power hoarding, the right to profit, the right to comfort, and objectivity are also important. And I think you will see them all show up as we're talking about the others. In fact, Akun has now bundled several of these together because the braids are so tightly woven to be pulled apart. My great hope is that by exploring these characteristics, you will be able to engage in a deeper reflection of the cultures that exist in your communities, families, and this congregation. I hope that you will be willing to conduct an honest inventory of how these characteristics have not served you or the larger culture. And I hope you will be willing to explore the antidotes as tools in building the beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. described. Now, I need to make a major caveat. I am going to be using the term and have our culture often in these sermons. And I want to be clear that I'm talking about Western Judeo-Christian culture, especially how it manifests in the United States. This is a predominantly white culture, and this culture affects everyone, no matter what your skin color is. But clearly it affects some of us in different ways and in different extremes. Akun says this about it. While white supremacy culture affects us all, harms us all, and is toxic to us all, it does not affect, harm, and violate us in the same way. White supremacy targets and violates BIPOC people and communities with the intent to destroy them directly. White supremacy targets and violates white people with a persistent invitation to collude that will inevitably destroy their humanity. Our experience of white supremacy culture and our navigation of white supremacy culture is very different based on who we are and our lived experience, our race, our class, our gender, our sexuality, our religion, all the ways that the ruling class or the power elite use to identify or define who is human and who is not, as well as all the way that oppressions intersect. White supremacy culture is inextricably linked to all of the other oppressions: capitalism, sexism, class and gender oppression, ableism, ageism, Christian hegemony. All of these and more are all interconnected and intersected and stirred together in a toxic brew that is reflected in our devastation of the air and the water and the land and living beings we have and are destroying and disregarding in the name of profit and power. So I invite you into this discernment of how we actively dismantle racism through looking at the culture that perpetuates it. I hope it inspires you, it clarifies for you, and maybe makes you just uncomfortable enough. And I give so much gratitude for this community where we can do this work together.
This is Deep River by Samuel Coleridge Taylor.
Thank you, Mary. So I was one of the kids who cried when she got a B in school, legitimately. Now, I was smart and I was hardworking, but I had gotten it ingrained in my head somehow that I had to do two things to be worthy as a child, I guess even a human being, really. I needed to behave, whatever that meant, and I needed to be an excellent student. What a crock of baloney. Really? How many sleepless nights did I spend worrying about a single test of something that I don't even remember now? How many tears did I shed worried that a teacher was going to be disappointed in me? Now I know teachers have much more things on their brains. And how much energy did I spend worrying about how others evaluated me rather than figuring out who I was as a human? Now, my mom always reassured me that my B was good enough, although I need to note that a C would have been problematic. But it was more than my parents. I was affirmed for getting all A's by relatives, the school system, colleges, and my peers. I was told my A's would help me to be whatever I wanted to be. Again, it was kind of a crock full of dog excrement. Kuhn says that perfectionism shows up in several ways. One is about the acknowledgement or appreciation. Perfectionism means that there is little or no appreciation expressed among people for the work that others are doing. And that when appreciation is expressed, it is often or usually directed to those who get most of the credit anyway. Instead, the majority of the focus is usually on how the person or the work is inadequate. And usually that isn't even done to the person directly. It's done through talking to others. There's not enough attention on what is going well, and instead there's a hyper-vigilance in what is wrong or needs corrected. I felt that. Instead of saying, oh, Christine, you got 98% of the questions right, I obsessed over the one or two that I missed. But what is even more tragic is how imperfections are seen. And let's be honest, we're all imperfect, right? We all acknowledge that. But perfectionism says that mistakes are personal, meaning that they reflect badly on the person making them, as opposed to being seen for what they are, mistakes. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake. Doing wrong is confused with being wrong. Wow, that's icky. There is also damage that is done internally for the perfectionist. Usually this perfectionism is so internalized that the person fails to appreciate their own good work. How many times is it seen as humble or self-deprecating to say, oh no, it wasn't that good. I screwed up here and here and here. Isn't it much more culturally acceptable to point out our faults or our failures? Bragging about our accomplishments is not as acceptable. I think that's kind of awful. So here's another awful part of perfectionism is who gets to define what is perfect? My math teacher? My parent? A community leader? Myself with standards that I couldn't ever achieve? Perfectionism assumes that we know what the standard is, and that standard is often defined by a narrow group of people, most often those who exist in white upper middle class paternalistic environments. So this affects everyone. It affects people of color, of course, but also those of us who are white and who live and identify as poor or working class. Those folks are under constant pressure to try to navigate this, to figure out, adapt to, assimilate into, and support this perfectionistic thinking and standards that they have little to no say in defining. For example, poor and working class white people almost always have to adopt upper middle class ways of talking or writing if the desire is to move up the hierarchies of power economically and socially. Akun is saying many of these things, I am adapting them liberally as I'm sharing them to you. For many folks of color, there is a feeling that you have to be super, ultra, mega perfect to fit in, or you just have to give up. You have to not only fit into these culturally defined ideas of perfectionism, but you have to exceed them as a person of color, and even more so if you are a female person of color. This feeling of needing to be exceptional can be paralyzing and impossible. It leads to tremendously destructive behaviors and even more of the feeling that one is never enough. Whew. Is anyone else feeling overwhelmed by this? Is anyone else feeling like they have been part of this part of the culture at one point or another in their life, or still maybe is? So we've established that this is harmful, not just for us individually, but impossible to achieve and an incredibly subjective thing to measure, except for those who are establishing the guideposts in the first place. So what are the antidotes to this culture? It's a lot of unprogramming, much of which many of you have already figured out. Like Carrie's comfortable house, it is understanding what is important to you and placing the unrealistic expectations to the side. For organizations, it means developing a culture of appreciation where the organization takes time to make sure that people's work and efforts are appreciated. When I think of this, I think of what happens behind the scenes in our worship services. I wish you all could see us. We are affirming and cheering. We are problem solving. We are rejoicing. We have the assumption that something will go wrong, and we are delighted and surprised when it doesn't. We appreciate the pieces that each of us add to the puzzle that is this weekly worship service. Just think about how good that would feel if we did this in every group we had. We also need to think of every single group that we might be in here at UUCP and outside as learning groups. It is expected that everyone will make mistakes and that those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. In these kinds of organizations, people realize that mistakes sometimes lead to positive results. They often can, and they're inevitable. So let's embrace them. The other thing we can do is write out of our UU first principle to acknowledge the worth and dignity of every person. We are capable of separating the person from the mistake. We can see and acknowledge the intent even when the impact is harmful. We can be generous of our support in finding ways to correct mistakes and affirming when they do. We do not have to label the person as bad when a mistake is happening. Why would we do that and still keep ourselves whole? And then, of course, some of the work is internal. That internal critic needs a hug. I learned that being my own critic did not actually improve my work. Instead, it just made me feel bad. It made others feel bad around me, and it did not make me learn anything so I could do it better the next time. Instead, we have the opportunity to celebrate the amazing, beautiful, unique, and imperfect creatures that we are, and that everyone else is too. We can shout out to the world our worth and awesomeness. So here's the trick. And you can tell everybody that your minister told you that you are dismantling white supremacy in order to stand on top of your desk and proclaim how awesome you are. Yep, please tell them that I said so. And do it for everyone else you are interacting with. And it is dismantling white supremacy to not be perfect and not to expect it of other people. This has been hugely liberating for me because it's like, look at me, I'm not perfect. I'm doing anti-racism work. And right here at UUCP, we are going to have the perfect opportunity to practice being imperfect. Last week, the staff, the board, and I agreed on a set of guidelines for when and how to reopen our campus, slowly, flexibly, and with an eye towards consent and inclusion. And you know what? I can already guarantee that the guidelines are imperfect. We are going to be imperfect in implementing them. And we are going to practice showing each other appreciation and understanding. And we're going to use each opportunity that we mess up as a way to do it better, with even more appreciation and understanding. What if we lived in that house that had no mirrors and our self-definition was crafted by the love we saw in each other's eyes? What would happen if we could let go of the impossible standards that are set by a small group of people that already have all the power? And what if we opened up ourselves to be authentically whole, feeling the abundance of the gifts that each person has to offer? What if we let go of the shackles of other people's expectations in order to find out what we really wanted for ourselves and our communities? Don't you see how that would make us more loving, supportive, and diverse? Personally, I like that vision rather than try that again, see, there's me being imperfect. Personally, I like that vision rather than the necessity to get all A's. I hope you all can join me in creating that vision, in living into our 8th principle, to becoming that beloved community. So might it be.
My hands are strong enough, they're strong enough, and I'm good enough. My hands are strong enough to give love. I know that my arms are long enough, they're long enough, and I'm good enough. My arms are long enough to give love. I know that my heart is wide enough, it's wide enough, I'm good enough. My heart is wide enough to give love. I know that my light is bright enough, it's bright enough, I'm good enough. My light is bright enough to give love. And my heart is wide enough to give love. I know that my arms are long enough to give love. My hands are strong enough to give love. Uh-oh. What problem is it? Not a problem at all. We fix. Boom. 1, 2, 3.
Go, Leah. So before closing hours, we'd like to invite you to coffee hour after the service. The link is in the chat. It will be on the final slide. Visitors, please join us And for those of you who would like to know more about UUCP, once a month we have a Get to Know UUCP meeting, and that's today. It will be also on the slide. We also have 3 of our children's ministries classes after the service. So as a sign of not being perfect, I didn't actually write the closing words. I'm going to make them up, and they're not going to be perfect. So here we go. May you go out and live into your full self. May you know that you don't have to be perfect. And may you know that the act of rejecting perfection is helping us all to build deeper connections with each other, understanding our differences, and working to change our culture so that we can be more inclusive, more diverse, more loving, more accepting. May it be in your life, and may all those around you feel the glow of acceptance. Go in peace, go in love, go in tons of imperfection.